We left off in the last video talking about the countercultural nature of the early church, and specifically the way that the early church empowered women in a way that was uncommon in the culture. And it was one way that the pagan world would look at Christians and mock them. Sometime in the 2nd century, there was an anti-Christian pagan named Celsus or Celsus, and he wrote a book called On True Teaching or True Doctrine, where he really attacked Christianity. We don't have a copy of that book, but we do have excerpts from it in the writings of Origen. In his book, Contra Celsus, or Against Celsus, he writes against Celsus's arguments, and in there he quotes much of what Celsus says. So what I want you to see is one of the ways that Celsus criticized Christianity in the 2nd century. He says, "Of Christians, the following are rules laid down by them. Let no one come to us who has been instructed, or who is wise or prudent, for such qualifications are deemed evil by us." In other words, he's pretending that Christians won't have any educated people or wise people around. They only want people who are uneducated, who are ignorant. Of course, that's not true, but that's the way he describes Christians. He says, "But if there be any ignorant or unintelligent or uninstructed or foolish persons, let them come with confidence. By which words, acknowledging that such individuals are worthy of their God, they manifestly show that they desire and are able to gain over only the silly and the mean and the stupid, with women and children." And he says, "Who's invited only foolish and low individuals and persons devoid of perception, and slaves and women and children, of whom the teachers of the divine word wish to make converts." So you see how he criticizes Christianity here? He says, because Christianity makes an appeal to women. Throughout the Roman world, the primary way that religion was passed was from a father to his children. His wife, all his slaves were expected to follow suit of whatever religion he was. But the fact that Christianity made appeals directly to individuals, to women, to children, assuming they would be children of age, and to slaves, shows that their recruiting was something that was seen with contempt by your educated Roman. So he says here, they make converts of slaves, women, and children. And so we know from reading the New Testament that this is exactly what you'd see. You'd see lots of women believers, lots of believers who've been slaves. So they're considered 2nd-class or 3rd-class citizens in the Roman Empire, but they're welcomed wholeheartedly by the church. So you see why this would be unappealing to many in the Roman world. This is a chart taken from Rodney Stark's book that talks about the data that we have from the 1st centuries AD, so during the Roman Empire, and specifically looking at all the different writings we have that document marriages and the ages of the people who were married and their religion. So he had over 300 documents. You can see it's the N equals 145 and 180. So add those together, you get over 300 documents that indicated marriage records. And what you could see is who got married, what religion they were, and the age at marriage, specifically the age of the females. And what is found here, this is a study done by Hopkins in 1965, is that it was much more common in the pagan world for Christians to get married under the age of 13, for the girl to be under the age of 13. So you realize that's 12 and below. About 1/5 of all the pagans were married. The females were under the age of 13, whereas about 1 out of every 16 or so of the Christians were. Likewise, 24% of the pagan marriages, the female was 13 or 14 years old. So around a quarter of all of the pagan females that were married, got married around the age of 13 or 14. But you see, there was only 13% of the Christian females. So only about 20% of Christian females in the Roman world were married below the age of 14. That means that the other 80% that got married at a later age. So this was uncommon in antiquity. They wanted their daughters to grow up to a greater age. Why? Because whenever Christianity goes somewhere, it raises the status of women. Any country where women are married at an extremely early age indicates how poorly they are treated in that country. So it would have been the case that Christians would have participated in arranged marriages, but they would have waited until the girls were older, and it would have been more appropriate. Those, of course, seem like very young ages to us, but they were the standard ages in the ancient world. But around half of all Christian women got married at the age of 18 or over, which would probably compare favorably to 19th century America. So this is just one piece of evidence to say there was something countercultural about the way that Christianity treated women. It gave them education. It gave them status. When the Christians participated in their worship services, men and women participated together. They went and sat down together. The women could hear the teaching. Whereas in the synagogue, or even in most of the Roman religions, the men and women were partitioned off, and they had their own things, and the men would never think of letting the women learn all the great truths of their religion, because why would you want to bother with women learning it? Whereas in Christianity, the status of females was raised. I'll put number 5 and number 6 together here. They were against sex outside of marriage. This fidelity was considered odd and against culture. Now, especially, it was considered odd for a man who was married not to have some kind of outside consorts. It was perfectly acceptable in Roman circles for a man to have his wife at home. Her primary role was to have children. But if he wanted to have sexual pleasure, he could visit prostitutes, he could visit temple prostitutes. And this wasn't considered somehow being unfaithful, because if he had sex with an unmarried woman, she didn't belong to any man. So it was considered acceptable. His wife was there to provide children for him. But as far as being devoted to her and her only in bed was foreign in the pagan world. But for Christians were taught a man can only have sexual relations with his wife, sex inside of marriage. And go even further, Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 7 that the man's body belongs to the woman, and the woman's body belongs to the man. Or I should say the husband's body belongs to the wife, and the wife's body belongs to the husband. So you have a mutual submission there. And this was new. This was odd in the Roman world. And, of course, it helped cut down on the number of sexually transmitted diseases. It also meant that a man was more likely to have sex with his wife and therefore have more children. So one of the things that Rodney Stark points out is that Christians were less likely to send their sons to war. They would not abort the females when they were born, or they wouldn't commit infanticide, wouldn't kill the females. And then the men, Christian men, were expected only to have sex with their wives. And so part of the result was you had a baby boom and a pretty steep population growth among the Christians, because they lived. They let their babies live. They had lots of children together, and they didn't go off and fight in wars, so they weren't their young men weren't being cut down in the prime of their lives. So that's just a sociological reason, but you see how this teaching about sex outside of marriage has an effect on a culture. So to go along with that, they were against homosexual relationships. This was not really frowned upon in the Roman culture. And especially the concept of pederasty, where a man could have a young boy as a sexual partner. And it's really, really odd to think of that today, but there are parts of the world where that's still practiced. And Christians were known for being against those kind of relationships. Let's move on. I'll put number 7 and number 8 together. They were exceptionally generous with their resources, and they were radically for the poor. in a way that the average Roman would never consider. And of course, this is because of the teaching of Jesus. You see this kind of thing in Acts, but you see it played out in history. First of all, we need to think about if something horrible happened, let's say a plague or a famine hit, how would most people in the ancient world handle that? Well, let's talk about plagues. Plagues in the ancient world, when they hit a city, people were unaware of exactly how diseases are communicated. All right, so they didn't know exactly how quarantine worked. They didn't know that kind of thing, but they did know this. If there was some kind of plague in a city, the best thing to do is to get out of Dodge. So that's generally what happened in the ancient world whenever rampant death took place in a city. But what were Christians supposed to do when they looked around and they saw their fellow men and women and children dying? What are they supposed to do? Well, they stayed and helped. So I'll just give you an example here. I know part of this is cut off on the bottom. This is written by Cyprian on mortality. And here he is talking about when famine hit. And he says, the just are dying with the unjust. That happens in famines. Everybody dies. It's not for you to think that the destruction is a common one for both evil and the good. The just are called to refreshment. In other words, when they die, when they get sick, they're called, carried to heaven. They're carried to be with Jesus. If the unjust are carried off to torture, protection is more quickly given to the faithful, punishment to the faithless. How suitable, how necessary is it that this plague and pestilence, which seems horrible and deadly, searches out the justice of each and every one, examines the minds of the human race, whether the well care for the sick, whether relatives dutifully love their kinsmen, as they should, whether masters show compassion for their ailing slaves, whether physicians do not desert the afflicted. Although this mortality has contributed nothing else, it has especially accomplished this for Christians and servants of God, that we have begun gladly to seek martyrdom while we are learning not to fear death. He says, we thank God for this, even though it's a horrible thing, because we know that this is a way to show what we really believe, that we show Christian love. Now, contrast this with what Thucydides wrote, now admittedly in an earlier time, when the Great Plague hit Athens in around 430 BC. He talks about how awful it was. The doctors were incapable of treating the diseases because of their ignorance of the right methods. And notice, these are pagans now. Equally useless were prayers made in temples, consultation of oracles, and so forth. And indeed, in the end, people were so overcome by their sufferings that they paid no further attention to such things. In other words, they saw the religion wasn't helping and they quit. They died with no one to look after them. Indeed, there were many houses in which all the inhabitants perished through lack of attention. You know, in the ancient world, they didn't know a lot about what we consider modern medicine, and especially to treat communicable diseases. But studies have shown that the primary way that a person could have lived through some horrible tragedy like a plague was simply to have a little bit of attention, have someone caring for them, bringing them water, cooling their heads, helping them go to the bathroom. Now, that won't save every person, but it dramatically increases a person's chances of surviving a plague. And that's what the Christians were doing. The pagans didn't do that. They got away, even with their own families, because they didn't know what to do and they were scared of dying. I've got another quote in here by Dionysius of Alexandria. I'll let you read that in the PDF. This is all, of course, commanded in the New Testament to take care of the poor. And also, you see it all throughout the writings of the early church. Let's put number 9 and number 10 together. They mixed races and social classes in ways that were unseen in their gatherings. So remember, slaves, women, and children. Celsus said he criticized Christians for having those. But also they mixed races. So Christianity was the first religion, if you will, to make an appeal to all races. Judaism, of course, that was for a specific race of people. And even Roman religions, even though they would often be syncretistic, and so that means a god in one place would just simply take a different name in another place. They kind of equate gods. But they tend to be local gods. But Christianity appealed to all people, and they came with this belief. Number 10, they believed only Christ was the way to salvation. Not terribly appealing to say that Jesus is the only way. Not appealing to Gentiles or to many of the Jews.